Horror has changed a lot over the years. Traditionally, each decade of horror brings us something that is everlasting in our hearts as a horror fan. Some films are bangers, and some make you want to drop a TV on your head after watching them.
In your dreams.
For all of my new viewers, like the video and subscribe to your boy Tech so you can join the spooky gang and come rock with me as we dive into what makes 90s horror so special. Alright, spooky gang, so 90s horror. 90s horror movies really feel like the tale of two different stories. There's the half that is pretty much a rehashing of all of the great films that we got in the 80s. And then the other end, there's an introduction to a formula that's fresh and new to the genre. And of course, they end up rehashing that too. For the people who haven't seen my videos on the previous 2 decades that we did, so we did a video on the 70s decade of horror and we did a video on the 80s decade of horror. Go check those out if you haven't seen it. But to explain a little bit of the difference between what you would see in your 80s films versus what you would see in your 90s films is in the 80s, they really set the foundation for pretty much a lot of our modern horror franchises. And it really solidified horror as a mainstream genre. Very well aware of all of our 80s cult classics and just some of those bangers that they dropped in the 80s. And then you transition into the 90s, where you have films that introduce modern and meta horror, which ended up leading into how a lot of our late 90s films and early 2000s films and how they were made. So starting out in the 90s, in 1990, you have movies like Misery, you have the It miniseries, you have Tremors, you have Child's Play 2, and one recurring theme that you're going to notice throughout a lot of the earlier films is similarly to what I said in the beginning. A lot of these movies are sequels to the horror that we loved in the late 70s and the early 80s. So by now, with a lot of these films, we on part 4, part 5, 6, 7, 8, 11, you know what I'm saying? Like, just many different sequels of some of our favorite horror icons and franchises. And you will see that as we move into 1991 as well. We have The Omen 4 and we have Freddy's Dead and we have The People Under the Stairs. So it's like in almost every single year, you might get that one banger that is truly a classic amongst all horror movies, especially for the 90s decade. But then almost all of the rest are going to be filled with the sequels of some of the most famous horror franchises. Same thing moving into 1992. You had a banger film like Candyman, which is its own original plot and script in the whole 9. And then you follow that up with Army of Darkness, Hellraiser 3, Aliens 3. You see what I'm saying? So, and the big thing that you will notice in, a lot of those sequels is a lot of the changes that they made between the 80s and the 90s for some of those sequels. So like if you notice in the 1980s, a lot of things were more so over the top, really gory, really campy. Practical effects and animatronics were widely used, and that's partly why we have such an appreciation for those films that were made in the 80s, because it genuinely makes the monsters and the gore really makes them feel tangible. Whereas in the 90s, you get more polished films, and the majority of them are more self-aware, and like I said, that meta aspect of things. The films were more psychological and really leaned into realism, and through that, that's why you see a bunch of, satirical moments in some of your favorite 90s horror movies, and, basically a lot of that being there to help deconstruct some of our traditional horror tropes. So then moving into 1993, we got movies like Body Bags, we have, Leprechaun, you have Man's Best Friend. In 94, you have Wes Craven's New Nightmare, Interview with a Vampire, which is also a banger, The Crow, Phantasm 3. In 1995, you have Halloween 6, and you have 7, you have Species. So you have some banger movies in the year that I was born, but then you have movies that are just like not really fan favorites at all. Like even for me, I actually do love Halloween 6, but I do recognize that that's not really that good of a movie. Then comes around 1996, and 1996 is where pretty much all of the difference for the decade was made. Outside of our classic movies like The Silence of the Lambs and like I said, 7 and It miniseries. In 1996, that's when we finally got Scream, The Frighteners, we got The Craft, we got From Dusk Till Dawn. 1996 pretty much as a whole was just pure bangers left and right. Like really can't beat some of the movies from that year. And even with me saying that, with some of the bangers that did come out each year of the 90s and even leading up to 1996, which was full of bangers, but still some of the differences that really was kind of like a make or break for the 90s is for CGI. In the 80s, like I mentioned earlier, there was plenty of practical effects, and that's what made those great in their own right. And then as we transition into CGI, CGI isn't bad when used correctly, but the problem is sometimes you get those studios that are pretty lazy and you get that cheap CGI. And not only do you get cheap CGI, but then you get the CGI for stuff that doesn't even make sense for them to be using CGI for. So it's just like, as we mentioned, some of the movies did it right, and then some was just like, why the hell did you do this? And then to add on to that, going back to my point that I made in the beginning of the video, is talking about how once Scream established sort of this real meta, self-aware type of horror where the characters, the script, the writing, just everything about it embodies and shows a level of appreciation towards some of our horror tropes. Then a good portion of movies after that tried to do the exact same thing, but they just didn't do it as well as Scream did it. So even though I Know What You Did Last Summer, you can truly see some of the influences from Scream. And that came out in 97, right along with movies like Anaconda, Wishmaster, and even Scream 2. Like Scream 2 came literally like dang near right after Scream 1. Like they were not playing no games. They saw the popularity of Scream, and as any movie production company will do, they're gonna do anything they can to quote unquote strike while the iron is hot and be able to really just cash in on the success of the first one. Was Scream 2 as good as the first one? No. They had a really dope intro scene with the movie theater and Omar Epps and Jada Pinkett Smith. Like that was really dope, but the rest of the movie to me wasn't necessarily as strong as Scream was. Then you move on to 98, you have Halloween H2O, which is basically Hollow Scream, because you have Michael Myers in it, but everything about it screams Scream. like is really ridiculous at this point. Then you have movies like The Faculty, which a lot of people like and I have a level of appreciation for. The Psycho remake, Blade, there are some pretty good movies that came out in 98. And then you move on to 1999, you got The Blair Witch, and you have House on a Haunted Hill. Once again, you still see some levels of that meta horror, self-aware horror, and a movie like The Haunting. So in totality, as I mentioned before, the 90s do have some bangers in there. Almost every single year has a banger that is revered as one of the best horror movies of all time. Like I'll say probably the majority of the years had that one movie that was like top 50 or top 75-ish. The problem is a lot of those movies after that are just sequels to our favorite franchises, or it's movies that are trying to rehash the concepts of being self-aware and meta. But I don't know. I mean, I like the 90s, but when we compare our 70s horror films and our 80s horror films and leading up to the 90s, I think both of the previous decades were better in my opinion. But that's not necessarily to shit on the 90s. And as we move forward into the 2000s and then the 2010s and the 2020s, obviously see more and more differences, but I can honestly say, and this is somewhat of a spoiler because I'm going to rank every single decade after we finish them all, but you can go ahead and put the 90s at the bottom for me. I can't even lie to y'all. Like I said, I do appreciate a lot of the things that they did bring, because then, to a degree, some movies that I love, like The Ring and other movies like Saw, wouldn't really exist, or at least they wouldn't exist the exact same way as we know them now. There's plenty of those 2000 films that wouldn't exist in the capacity in which we know them without the history of horror and a lot of the things that the 1990s provided. But y'all let me know, Spooky Gang, let me know what y'all think of 1990s horror, and what are some of your favorite movies out of the decade, and is there a particular year that you like, a little bit more than others? Y'all comment that down below. Y'all subscribe to the kid. We're on the road to 10K subs. Y'all know how we coming. Gonna keep putting these bangers out. Ain't never gonna stop. And I also do have a question for you, Spooky Gang. How would y'all feel if I start live streaming horror games? I really want to get into bringing you more content, and content that might be a little more diverse. So getting into the gaming aspect of things and having like a Fright Night Fridays or a Spooky Saturday, Scary Saturday, something like that, for me to live stream, and then, you guys join the chat, and then we, chop it up on Fridays and Saturdays, and just give you extra content to watch in between the release of each of these videos that I do weekly. So y'all let me know if that's something that y'all be interested in, and if so, what particular games would you be interested in seeing? Comment that down below. But other than that, Spooky Gang, man, I hope y'all have a blessed day, and until next time, y'all stay blessed and y'all stay spooky.